Welcome to the second episode of the Muslim Collective podcast. We have with us here today Saffron Zomer from the Australian Democracy Network. Saffron is a lawyer, campaigner, and political strategist with more than a decade of experience leading law reform campaigns. Prior to the Australian Democracy Network, Saffron was Government Relations Manager at the Australian Conservation Foundation. She spent several years living and working in the US, where she held a range of campaign and government relation roles. In 2017, Saffron co-founded and led the Hands Off Our Charities Alliance, which secured critical changes to 2017 Electoral Act amendments to protect the rights of civil society organizations to engage in advocacy. The Australian Democracy Network is creating a healthy Australian democracy that puts people and the planet first. They bring people and organizations together to campaign for the changes that make democracy more fair, open, participatory, and accountable. The Australian Democracy Network was founded collaboratively in 2020 by the Human Rights Law Centre, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and the Australian Council of several social services with support from Manifera. We will include all the links to the website's social media handles in the description of this video. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us and giving us your time today, Saffron.
So welcome. Thanks for having me.
So today we will talk about the state of our democracy. Political apathy is growing in democracies around the world. It stems from alienation, disaffection, and an overall sense of powerlessness that people feel. Trust in governments and institutions are at an all-time low, according to a recent poll. But what's interesting is that 72% of people refer to this rich and powerful as the greatest threat that this nation faces, not some foreign state or government or a terrorist organization. So if I were to analyze these findings, what tells me is that people feel that they've lost control over their future, over how this country is run, and they might not be able to put their finger on it exactly what's the problem, but they have a general sense that despite being in a democracy, but despite being in a free society, they actually don't have a lot of power, and it's an elite shadow organization, some invisible group of people who seem to have power. So it was when I was trying to understand this, that's when I came across your report, Confronting State Capture. And I just want to add here, before we go any further, that report that I read, Confronting State Capture, that's one of the scariest things that I've ever read. It's more scary than any horror film. So if you enjoy horror, I would recommend you to read this report. So what is state capture? How would you frame it in simple terms?
Good question. So the World Bank defines state capture as the exercise of power by private actors to shape policies or implementation in service of their narrow interests. So basically, any time a private interest, an industry group, for example, is able to exert so much influence over policy-making process that they can get outcomes which put their private interests or profits ahead of the public interest, that's state capture. And it can be accomplished through a range of different channels, I suppose, including the private money that goes into the political system, relationships, revolving doors between industry and politics, and most industries that succeed in achieving state capture use a lot of different tactics. But I guess the hallmark of it is that you wind up capturing the mechanics of policy making. So it's like you've actually captured the political machinery, which is different to winning any particular outcome on a specific issue, although of course that happens as well under conditions of state capture. And I think it's really useful to articulate the concept of state capture and define it like this, because as you said, I think polling and people's general sense shows us that there is a lot of concern amongst the general voting population that the systems that we have aren't working in our best interests. They're working for the interests of the rich and powerful. People know this, but they don't always have words to explain this kind of intuitive understanding that they have of how the system is failing us. So one of the reasons that we wrote this report, Confronting State Capture, was actually just to give all of us shared language to describe this problem. So that once we have a shared understanding of what's happening, we could then talk about how to fix the problem. Until you have language to describe it, it's like wrestling with a ghost. It's just very difficult to pinpoint what feels wrong.
Sure. So let me bring up two recent incidents in the news, and you tell us how this falls under the framework of state capture. So first, we have the PwC ATO federal government scandal. The Australian government institutions, including the Australian Federal Police, hired the PwC for a host of consulting services. The government seeks the advice of PwC on tax laws targeted at multinational companies. The PwC then uses this knowledge, inside knowledge, as leverage in its business relationships with those private multinational companies. So I have two questions. Number one, why does the government need to hire the services of a private organization? Why isn't there a government agency that can do this job, which will protect, which will avoid this conflict of interest? And secondly, given that this is actually very common, as your report states, that governments regularly hire private organizations, why aren't there strict regulations to prevent this kind of conflict of interest?
Good questions, both of them. So what you're describing with work that would traditionally have sat within the public service, so the government essentially being outsourced, there's a term for that called the cycle of depletion. So governments choose to move these projects out of the public service. That means that they can cut staff from the public service and use that money to pay external services to do the work. But what that generally means is that over time, the public service itself becomes smaller, it loses skills, it loses institutional knowledge of issues. And so then it becomes harder for the public service to do the work that it's designed to do. And you wind up in this cycle where moving the work out into private entities makes sense. Of course, the big consultancies also do make political donations, so the money goes round in a circle. And to your second question about why there isn't conflict of interest regulation in place, I think part of the real problem of the dynamic of state capture is that once you've successfully managed to capture the mechanics of regulation and policy making, you get to define what is corrupt and not corrupt behavior, what is okay and not okay. So you get to define what is normal, like what is business as usual. And I think we've seen over a number of years with this cycle of depletion and then more and more work being put into these big consultancies, that's become normalized, and it's led to the scandals that have erupted recently. It's also there are so many threads of this, like the whole dynamic of state capture is always very multifaceted. Like it isn't just one thing happening, it's always a number of things happening. Another thing that's very common in public service departments is secondments. So you'll send public servants to work in the industry that they're regulating for a period of time, supposedly to gain more understanding of industry needs or technical expertise or whatever, but actually like this is a critical function of the revolving door where you go into industry, you get indoctrinated with their perspective, you form relationships inside the industry bodies, and then you move back into the public service. You get to a point where the public service doesn't even need to ask what industry would prefer. They already know, it's so deeply internalized. So I think if you put all of these things together, you're right, it is a really concerning view of where our government apparatus is going. And it really matters because a lot of these huge policy decisions that our government makes are based on advice from the public service or from one of these big four. And a lot of the critical services that people need are delivered by these government departments. So it really matters if they're fit for purpose and up to the job.
Right. Thank you. I will just pause this for a bit. So this is how I understand it in a nutshell. Government, by its very definition, exists to serve and protect the public interest and provide essential services like healthcare, infrastructure, education, etc. Yet, what I understand of state capture, we have an extremely organized and efficient system in place that uses the entirety of the state's resources, which is funded by the taxpayer, to not serve the public, but it serves very specific, private interests with who have power and privilege. Would you say this is an accurate, framing of what state capture is?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I guess the one caveat I would share is that, even under a scenario of state capture, it doesn't mean that it's a completely failed state. The government's still obviously making policy, it's providing services. In fact, if you compare Australia to many other places, there's lots about our political system and democracy that's incredibly functional, and we need to make sure we keep it that way. But yes, I think that is a fair description of how state capture works. It's a systematic way that powerful interests can maintain control over both sides of politics so that they can get outcomes that serve them at the expense of the rest of us.
Sure. So your report states, and I quote, dominating one major party in isolation does not constitute state capture. To be able to endure through election cycles and to ensure that policies unfavorable to the captor are killed off at the earliest possible stage. It's a key element of state capture is the management of political parties, both in government and opposition. So how is this domination and control of both the major parties achieved?
So we have this handy little 2-pager that we made from our report, which is up on our website. We describe 6 key channels through which state capture is accomplished. But within each of those 6 categories, of course, there is like many layers and nuances around how these tactics are actually deployed. But perhaps I'll just run through like the 6 that we identified as the key ways that state capture is accomplished. So the first is financial interventions in politics. So this can look like political donations. And generally, as you say, they'll be made on a bipartisan basis, but they can also be used to punish or reward parties, so that if a particular side of politics puts up a policy that goes against the industry's preferences, they can give a big donation to the other side of politics. They can also use money to spend in elections to punish a party that is moving forward with a policy platform that they don't approve of. And there are a number of examples of how this has played out in Australian politics over the years. So the second is lobbying and personal influence. So these big companies employ these kind of all-in-one service provider lobbyist firms who will do research and public relations, and they're often staffed by former MPs who still have a lot of close personal networks amongst the government and opposition, but they'll also do a lot of in-house lobbying. So they'll use their money to create opportunities for access to political decision makers and public service. And over time, when they have access to them repeatedly, they build these long-term high trust relationships. So some of this happens through these business forums that both parties have, so that you can sign up to become a member of a business forum and essentially pay for access to politicians. But then, of course, there's, events and delegations and site visits and golf course opportunities and the whole gamut. So there's a really deep interconnection of industry and politics right across the board, which in some ways I feel like is the hardest to see because a lot of it isn't really public that it's happening, but it can be the most effective way of exerting influence over the parties. The third way is connected to that, revolving doors and personnel exchange. So it's very common for senior politicians to leave politics and the very next day take a job as a lobbyist for the industry that they just finished regulating. So they take all of their insider knowledge and all of their connections and everything that they've learned whilst they were a minister and use it in the service of the industry. And of course, they know that when they leave politics, they'll want to use this golden parachute, which really influences how strict they're willing to be with these industries that they're supposed to be regulating. But it happens at all levels of politics and through the public service as well. So you'll see recruitment from industry bodies into political offices and then movement the other way as well. And people, well, they call it the revolving door because staff will just cycle through from industry to politics to industry to politics. So in some ways, it becomes very difficult to tell the difference because there's so much personnel exchange. And that's a really, really effective way of accomplishing state capture. The fourth way that we describe is institutional repurposing. So you take an institution that was set up for a public interest purpose, and over time you might tweak it a little bit, amend its terms of reference a little bit, make some appointments to its board or senior leadership who are from the industry that it's supposed to be regulating. And then over time, you can fundamentally reorient a regulatory body or a public institution away from its core mission to something that is almost the opposite of it. Research and policy making is the fifth avenue. So these industries have resources to basically write their own laws, write amendments to laws, write policies that then become laws. And that's a really important way that they influence processes. And oftentimes other interest groups, like for example, nonprofits or charities, just don't have anywhere near the resources that these big industry groups will have. So it's far from a level playing field in terms of a contest of ideas and input. And finally is the public influence campaign. So using their large financial clout to influence the public view of what good policy should be. And in the report, we quote Rebecca Huntley, who has a nice term for that, which is accompanying the state capture. She talks about culture capture, where the industries get to describe what we call like the Overton window of what's politically possible. So industry will choose, policy can be within these parameters, not outside of it, and politicians will just accept it. So you put all those six venues of interference together, and you can have a really sophisticated approach to political control over time.
Right. When winning the battle of ideas is no longer the objective and truth is an object of attack, disorientation becomes the defining characteristic of the information environment, according to US analyst Laura Rosenberger that you've quoted in your report. So how do they shape and manipulate, public opinion using both traditional and social media? And secondly, this is going to sound scary, but are they also affecting our ability to differentiate truth from falsehood? Like, for example, using terminology like safeguard mechanisms, which sounds very safe, but I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, or natural gas.
Yeah.
Sounds very natural, doesn't it? Yes, I think it is a little bit scary, and I think the emergence of social media and digital technologies has really gotten ahead of our understanding of how to regulate and control those spaces so that they're democratically safe. I mean, I can think of lots of examples of this, but the fossil fuels industry was able to cast doubt over whether the 2019 fires were in fact like climate change induced. They were like spreading these stories about whether there might have been just arson or something. And there's lots of useful analysis done of how some of these industries use astroturfing. So they'll set up basically shopfront charities or community organizations that don't really exist to drive social media stories that are disinformation. They can also use bots. So there are so many different tools that they have available to manipulate people's information environment. And that is definitely happening. And it's a really tricky area to regulate as well. So something that I think a lot of people who think deeply about the media and information ecosystem are pretty worried about for good reason. And I mean, we've seen that in overseas elections that has played out in much more concrete ways than I suppose we've seen it in Australia, but there's no reason why that couldn't happen here as well.
Right. So speaking of elections, your report quotes a former Australian electoral commissioner, and he says that Australia's financial disclosure system is one of the worst in the world. And at the time of voting, the voter is actually not made aware of who is funding whom and which party is being funded by who and how much. Reporting only occurs annually when the AEC publishes returns each February. Yeah. So let me ask you this question about last year's federal elections. We had a federal election last year in March. So when would we actually know the funding sources of that election? Would it be this year?
Yeah, so if you have an election in March, then you will get the data dump the following February, is generally the way that it happens. But I think the thing, like, that's outrageous on its own, right? Because the election happened nearly a year ago. It's far too late to know who bankrolled it. But also, once the data dump comes out, like, if you or me wants to understand what the data means, like, it's a 2-week project, even for someone who spends their whole life as an academic specializing in this field. There's thousands of lines of data. The data's not clean, so you need to do all this cross-referencing to find out exactly which donations might have been double entries or the same entity but using slightly different names. Like, the whole system is a mess, really, and very inaccessible to someone who just wants to understand what private money fueled an election. And then actually the AEC has said that, their enforcement ability is so minimal that they can't even really guarantee to us that the data that is released is an accurate representation of what happened. So our transparency regime is appalling, not to mention that what is reported when we get that data dump is only a very small minority of all the money that goes into politics. Most of it is dark money. It's undisclosed. We don't actually know where it comes from. So yes, the state of our transparency regime is really poor.
Right. So you cite a report from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that says that Australia hosts a large number of subsidiaries of top 15 global arms manufacturers, but to what extent do they use the national security excuse to cover up the both parties, they cover up this nexus by saying, look, we need national security, and that's why we have to go into deals with these manufacturers.
Yeah, to a very significant extent, I think, is the short answer. For the arms industry, they don't need to build social license with the public in the same way as many other industries do, because they really only have one customer, which is the government. So for this particular industry, the revolving door, I think, is probably their most valuable vehicle for state capture. So there's a lot of interconnection between the industry and the government. And I think, if anything, transparency over defence spending decisions has gotten worse over the years rather than better. And nobody seems to be interested in reversing that trend. So yeah, I think the invocation of national security to deny any kind of transparency over those spends is a huge red flag. And have you come across the concept of the polluter's paradox?
No.
So it basically posits that if you're an industry whose business model involves harming people's health or the planet, so you create a lot of pollution or you sell a product like cigarettes that kills people, then any good government would be motivated to regulate you, because your business model is inherently bad for the planet and for people. So those are the industries that are the most highly incentivized to spend money on resisting regulation. And the way that they do that is to capture the states so that they have power over the policy making mechanisms, and they can just veto regulations that harm them. And you can see the fossil fuels industry do this. The tobacco industry did this. You know, they're probably the best industry of all of them. They wrote the playbook on how to capture the state. So yeah, like the weapons industry, I mean, arguably some people might say they have a place to do their thing, but I think for most people, yeah, like they would be considered a harmful industry. And the amounts of money that are spent on defense are actually, like, for people like you and me who have normal sized bank accounts, it's almost hard to understand like what those numbers mean. They're so big. So I think it's really a flag that there's a lot of secrecy. The amount of money that's going out from government into these industries is mind-boggling. And there's secrecy around this all. So I think, like, we can assume that there is a really high level of state capture that's going on.
So, you know, a fundamental aspect of democracy is an elected government that is in charge of the state. And it's theoretically, it's meant to serve the public interest and provide material gains for the people. So from everything that we've discussed so far and what your report details, it appears that this state, as it exists today, it's no longer able to protect our interests. The entirety of the state apparatus now, funded by our tax dollars, serves very powerful private interests, while we have our, you know, essential workers who are struggling to make their ends meet. Marginalized people that the state should be looking after are being discarded. And ordinary people, regular Australians, facing a cost of living crisis. So, taking all of that into account, what does this mean for Australian democracy? Like, how healthy is Australian democracy today?
I mean, I guess broadly, there are some trends that are really concerning. And I think if we learned anything over the last few years from watching liberal democracies around the world, it's to understand that there is no such thing as a solid and secure democracy. And the line between a functional and dysfunctional political system is very thin. And that's true even in places where people really thought, if there's one place that democracy is safe and secure, it's the UK or it's the US. And like, we've seen that that's really just not true. So I feel like in any democracy, power and the ability to control the outcomes of government is always going to be contested, and that's okay. I think the kind of underlying problem that we are facing is that there's a concept around democracy that I like, which is to imagine democracy as a triangle. So if you say that the top of the triangle is what we call representational democracy. So this is what goes on up at Parliament House. We elect people, they go up to Parliament House, they make decisions on our behalf. It's their job to represent us. So when we talk about politics or democracy in Australia, that's usually what we're talking about, that kind of democracy. But you can look further down the triangle, and if you call the left point participatory democracy, you can think of that as all the ways that each of us as citizens and voters can engage in our democracy. We might choose how to vote. We could vote in a referendum. We could call our MP and share an opinion. We could give a political donation. We could write a letter to the editor. These are all ways that we can engage in public debates. And on the other side of the triangle is the place that I am most interested in terms of like how healthy is our democracy, which some people call associational democracy. It means different things to different people, but in my definition, it's all of the ways that we participate in public life through groups and community organizations where we come together with others from our community or who share an interest or concern that we have, and we join up with others who share our worldview or perspective. And the reason I think this associational democracy is so important is that in these groups, that's often the place that we learn the skills of active citizenship. So that's how we learn how to be effective citizens. But any one of us in a democracy as big as a nation state, our single voice is pretty meaningless, right? Like, we can have as many opinions as we want. It's not going to change the world. It's not going to shift any outcomes. The only way that we can make ourselves relevant to a national debate is by joining up with other people who share our perspective or our concerns or are from our community. And so over the years, the ways that we all interact with associational democracy, these local community groups, unions membership has declined, membership in faith-based organizations has declined, membership in charities and nonprofits and advocacy organizations like mine has declined, volunteering hours has declined, even the number of close friends or neighbors that people say they know has declined. So on the whole, we feel a lot more isolated, and we feel less connected to the source of our citizen power, which is being together with other citizens who share our worldview and figuring out what to do about it together. I think that's a big part of this vicious cycle of disengagement, because we feel like we're alone. We know that our single voice makes no difference. We see these huge problems like you described, inequality, people being left behind. It feels so much bigger than us, and we don't have the connections in the community to build collective power to make our voice heard. So I think, obviously, I've just taken the scenic route to answering your question for us, but I think a lot of it for me is organizations like the ones that we both represent, where we invite people to re-engage in public life, in community, and together we can be part of shaping political outcomes that impact us. So I think if we just leave it to the folks who are elected to lead us in the top of that democracy triangle, and we let our part just be showing up every 4 years to eat a democracy sausage and vote, then I'm really worried about what happens next in our democracy. I think it could be really, really, really bad. But democracy is government by people. So it's entirely up to us how our democracy will be shaped in the future. And to me, like, you've seen the influence of these corporate powers grow. They've got more lobbyists, they've got more money, they're doing such a good job of capturing the state. It's out of balance, and we need civic spaces and community organizations to be repopulated with active, engaged citizens to rebalance the whole system so that we can get a democracy back that works for us.
Right. Thank you. You've already touched upon a lot of the points that my next question was about, which is that the foundation of democracy that I've grown up with, the idea of democracy that I've grown up with, is one person, one vote. And one of the scary things that I found in your report was that it's actually very easy to predict elections, the outcome of elections, because all you have to look at is which party has raised the most money, and they're going to win the elections. So in this scenario, and I will add here that elections do cost a lot of money. To run for public office costs a lot of money. So in this situation that we find ourselves in, can democracies, liberal democracies, representative democracies, still produce a government that provides material gains for the people and protects public interest?
Yes, I choose to be optimistic about that question and say that they can. And I think even as entrenched as state capture is in our system, there are definitely still people who are elected to federal government who are not captured, who don't take corporate money, and who really do genuinely represent their communities. And there are minor parties who've also decided that they don't want to participate in that system. So we have hard evidence that it's possible to be electorally successful without engaging in that dirty way of doing politics. But I guess it's as I said, like the balance is definitely the wrong way at the moment. And I think I just come back to the same point, which is that in politics, the only thing that elected officials think about more than money is votes, because we get to decide in the end. Like we have the political power, we loan it to the people that we elect, and we can take it back. So in the end, I think it can be very easy to forget your own agency in this system. But it's 100% true that engaged voters who care about the outcomes can completely shift the whole system, because it still is fundamentally a people-powered system. And so I think it is true right now that you can predict the outcome of election by knowing who's going to spend the most money, but it's not a truism. It could certainly fail to be true in the future. And it's all of us who will decide whether to make that change. I think one of the things that is hardest about having these conversations about politics and democracy is that people have such a jaded view of the system because they've seen such bad behavior, they feel disempowered. It's not clear what any of us individually can do to make a difference. So disengaging feels like a reasonable thing to do. And so I never want to reinforce those feelings of cynicism and disengagement, because the truth is that, like, in a democracy, people are the solution. So the minute that we give up on the system and say that it's just not capable of change, we have sealed our own fate, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah. The late comedian George Carlin had famously described American democracy as, it's a big club and you ain't in it. But he also said that what this big club doesn't want is a population of well-educated, informed people capable of critical thinking and asking questions. Your report, Confronting State Capture, you've provided us with the most comprehensive framework to understand how our system works. This report gives us the tools to educate ourselves, to inform ourselves, and equip ourselves to ask critical questions. So I would like to thank you for all the work that has gone, that has taken place to prepare this report, all the research, all the hours spent in compiling all of this, and for the public good, for the public benefit. And I would recommend everyone to go and download this report and read it. It's called Confronting State Capture. We will include the link in the description of this video. And I want to thank you for giving us your time today, and any final words that you would like to share.
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive, and I just always close out these conversations by saying it's important to look the big problems that we have straight in the eye, but don't make the mistake of thinking that they're bigger than us, because when people come together in community, there's really so much potential for positive change. And if you've been inspired by anything that you've heard in this conversation, or when you read our report, please come over to our website and join us, or join the organization that's doing the work that's closest to your heart, because that is really when democracy comes alive and works the way it's supposed to. So really, invitation to everyone out there to figure out what active citizenship looks like to you, and go do it.
Yes, and this conversation was, the main objective for this conversation was to, it's meant to work as an introduction. It's meant to work as a start of something. So we want people to, start with this conversation here, and then go on to educate themselves, inform themselves, and understand how, the system works. And we will share all the links. We'll share the link to Australian Democracy Network, and on their website, they have a range of reading resources, learning material, both audiovisual and reading material that people can, and it's all freely available. And people, I would request everyone to go onto the website find the information, educate yourself, inform yourself. And the one thing, as we've said before, the one thing that they're scared of is an informed citizenry. The more informed the voters are, the worse it is for them.
Thanks so much for having me, Faraz. It was really fun chatting.
Thank you, Saffron. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you.